Let's begin with something that requires us to reframe the entire conversation. When most people talk about no contact, they frame it as a strategy, a technique, something you deploy, like a chess move, to protect yourself from further harm. And while that framing is not wrong, it is incomplete, because to truly understand why a narcissist panics, not just feels uncomfortable, not just feels inconvenienced, but genuinely panics. When a super empath goes no contact, we need to understand what was actually being lost. We need to understand what a super empath represented in the economy of the narcissist psychological world. And to do that, we need to talk about supply, but not supply in the generic sense. We established earlier that narcissistic supply is the lifeblood of the narcissistic ego, the constant stream of attention, reaction, admiration, and emotional engagement that substitutes for the internal self-regulation a healthy psychology naturally provides. People in a narcissist orbit provide what we might call standard grade supply. They react, they engage, they occasionally push back. They provide enough emotional material to keep the narcissist's ego functioning at a baseline level. But a super empath is categorically different. And the difference is not merely quantitative. It is not simply that they provide more supply. It is that they provide a quality of supply that the narcissist has never encountered anywhere else and critically cannot replicate with anyone else. Here is why. The super empath feels with extraordinary depth and precision. Their emotional intelligence is not a casual trait. It is a finely tuned instrument, developed often through years of their own pain, their own navigating of difficult relationships, their own hard-won understanding of the human interior. They do not just react, they respond. They do not just notice, they understand. To a narcissist, whose entire psychological architecture is built around the desperate need to be seen, to be felt, to be registered as significant by another human consciousness, this depth of perception is not just appealing. This is addictive in a way that nothing else can match. Think of it in neurochemical terms. Research into attachment and reward systems, drawing on the work of scholars like Jack Panksepp, who mapped the brain's emotional operating systems, suggests that the quality of emotional attunement we receive from another person directly influences the intensity of our attachment to them. The more precisely someone sees us, the more powerfully we bond to that perception. The narcissist, who craves above all else the experience of being seen as extraordinary, finds in the super empath something that triggers the deepest possible version of that reward. The super empath does not just admire them superficially. They engage with them fully. They challenge them, forgive them, return to them, try to understand them, and all of that. The full, rich, complex relational engagement registers in the narcissist system as the most potent supply they have ever consumed. This is why the relationship often feels, even to outside observers, inexplicably intense. Toller, the narcissist pursues the super empath with an urgency that borders on obsession. Why they escalate when the empath begins to pull away, because they are not simply losing a relationship. They are losing their primary source of psychological sustenance, the one person whose perception of them felt, however distorted, like genuine recognition. And when no contact arrives, not as a threat, not as a temporary withdrawal, but as a complete and final silence, the narcissist does not simply feel rejected. They experience the particular terror of an addict, watching their last supply disappear over a horizon they are powerless to cross, knowing somewhere beneath the denial that nothing will ever replace what they have just lost. To truly understand what happens next, what unfolds in the narcissist interior world after that silence descends, we need to go deeper than supply. We need to talk about something more fundamental, more existential, and in many ways more tragic. We need to talk about the mirror. In developmental psychology, the concept of mirroring originates with Donald Winnicott, the British pediatrician and psychoanalyst whose work on early childhood gave us some of our most penetrating insights into how the self forms. Next, Winnicott observed that an infant first discovers its own existence, its own emotional reality, by looking into the face of its primary caregiver and seeing itself reflected back. The mother who looks at her child with genuine delight, with authentic attunement, with full presence, gives that child something irreplaceable. She gives them the experience of being real, of mattering, of existing in a way that another consciousness recognizes and affirms. When that mirroring is absent, distorted, or conditional, when the child looks into the caregiver's face and sees not themselves but the caregiver's own needs, fears, or indifference, something in the developing self fails to fully consolidate. The child learns, at the deepest pre-verbal level, that their inner world is either invisible or unwelcome. And one of the adaptations that can emerge from that foundational wound, one of the psychological architectures built to compensate for that missing reflection, is what we recognize as narcissism. The narcissist, then, is not simply someone who loves themselves too much. They are someone who never received the quality of mirroring that would have allowed a stable, authentic self to form. And so they spend their lives in a relentless, largely unconscious search for the mirror they never had. They need someone to reflect back their significance, their brilliance, their specialness, because without that external reflection, the self, never properly anchored from within, begins to dissolve. And here is the profound, painful paradox at the center of the narcissist's relationship with a super empath. The super empath, by virtue of their extraordinary perceptual depth, becomes the most complete mirror the narcissist has ever encountered. Not because they simply flatter or validate. A superficial admirer can do that, but because they genuinely engage with the full complexity of who the narcissist is. They see the wounded child beneath the grandiosity. They sense the fear beneath the aggression. They perceive, with an accuracy that is almost uncanny, the original pain that generated the entire defensive structure, and they stay anyway. They try to reach that buried self. They believe, often at great cost to themselves, that their love and understanding can bridge the gap between who the narcissist pretends to be and who they might genuinely become. To the narcissist, this is not just relationship. This is the closest thing to genuine mirroring they have ever experienced. The super empath sees through the mask, and that experience of being seen through, rather than driving the narcissist toward authenticity, often intensifies the attachment to a degree that becomes consuming. Because somewhere beneath the defense system, the original wounded self recognizes something it has been searching for since the very beginning. When the super empath goes no contact, they do not simply withdraw their presence. They withdraw the mirror. And for a self that was never fully formed without external reflection, that withdrawal is not merely painful. It is structurally destabilizing. The narcissist is left alone with an interior landscape they have spent an entire lifetime engineering elaborate systems to avoid confronting. No supply can replicate this loss. No new relationship can immediately substitute for it. Because what is gone is not just a person. To what is gone is the only reflection that ever came close to showing them something real. And without it, they are left facing the one thing their entire existence was constructed to escape, themselves. So we have established what is lost when the super empath disappears. The supply drought, the shattered mirror. But now I want to examine something that operates alongside both of those losses, something that in many ways is the most immediately destabilizing of all three, because it dismantles not just the narcissist's emotional world, but their entire operational system. Talk about control. And more specifically, we need to talk about what happens when the most sophisticated control system a narcissist has ever built suddenly encounters a wall it cannot penetrate, a door it cannot open, a person it can no longer reach. Because here is something that gets overlooked in most conversations about narcissism. The relationship with the super empath was never simply emotional for the narcissist. It was also always a project, a careful, painstaking, years-long accumulation of intelligence. Every conversation was data. Every vulnerability the super empath shared became a coordinate on a psychological map. Every fear, every insecurity, every pattern of behavior, every soft place where love and guilt and obligation intersected, all of it was cataloged, consciously or not, into an extraordinarily precise instrument of influence. This is not cynicism. This is simply what narcissistic relationship dynamics produce. The narcissist, whose survival is always dependent on their ability to manage how others perceive and respond to them, becomes a student of the people in their orbit in a way that can easily be mistaken for deep interest or even intimacy. And with a super empathist whose emotional interior is so rich, so layered, so genuinely complex, that study becomes the most intricate work the narcissist has ever undertaken. They know exactly which words produce guilt. They know precisely which tone of voice reactivates the empath's caregiving instincts. They know when to withdraw warmth and when to flood with it. They have learned, with a craftsman's precision, how to play every register of this particular instrument. And then, without warning, the instrument is gone. No contact does not simply remove the super empath's presence. It renders the entire map obsolete. Every psychological lever the narcissist identified becomes inaccessible. Every carefully learned trigger becomes irrelevant. The guilt cannot be activated if there is no one receiving the message. The charm cannot be deployed if there is no one in the room. The narrative cannot be rewritten if the other person has permanently stepped outside the story. Erich Fromm, in his penetrating analysis of what he called the authoritarian character, observed that the need to control others is almost always rooted in a profound incapacity to tolerate uncertainty, particularly the uncertainty of one's own interior world. Control, in this framework, is not about power for its own sake. It is about the terror of power, turlessness, and the narcissist, whose inner world is a landscape of unresolved chaos, carefully hidden beneath a surface of certainty and dominance, experiences the loss of control over the super empath not merely as frustration, but as existential threat. Gabor Mate speaks often about how our compulsive behaviors, whatever form they take, are always attempts to regulate an internal state we lack the tools to manage directly. The narcissist's compulsion to control their relational environment is no different. It is self-medication. It is the external management of an internal disorder. And when that management system collapses completely, when the most sophisticated version of it they ever constructed simply ceases to function, the panic is not theatrical. It is not performed for effect. It is not performed for effect. It is the genuine, unmedicated terror of a system that has just lost its primary coping mechanism. Because when you remove not just your presence, but every point of access, every emotional entry point they spent years carefully mapping, you do not simply leave the narcissist without a relationship. When do you leave them without the only architecture that made them feel, however falsely, that they were in control of their world? We have been moving deliberately through layers. We have been moving deliberately through layers. From the surface, the loss of supply, down through the structural, the shattered mirror, the collapsed control system. But now I want to take us somewhere that most conversations about narcissism rarely go, because what we have discussed so far, as significant as it is, still describes the outer architecture of the narcissist's experience. It describes what they lose, what gets dismantled, what stops functioning. What stops functioning? What I want to examine now is what gets exposed. Because when everything that was built to protect, to manage, to deflect, to perform, when all of that loses its primary target and begins to fall away, something is revealed underneath. Something that was there long before the narcissism, long before the grandiosity and the manipulation and the carefully constructed mask. Something that, in a very real sense, is the narcissism, not its expression, but its origin, its source code, the wound. Not a metaphorical wound, a genuine, early, often proverbial rupture in the developing self's experience of being loved unconditionally. Every credible psychological framework that has seriously engaged with narcissistic personality development, from Cohen's self-psychology to attachment theory, to the developmental trauma work of Alan Shore, arrives at the same essential finding. Beneath the inflated self-presentation, beneath the entitlement and the exploitation and the absence of genuine empathy, there is a child who learned, at the most foundational level of psychological formatio, that their authentic self was not enough, that love was conditional, that safety required performance, that vulnerability was dangerous. And so the narcissistic personality was constructed, not chosen, but constructed as a survival response, a way of moving through a world that felt fundamentally threatening to the true self. The grandiosity was not arrogance. It was armor. The need for admiration was not vanity. It was a substitute for the unconditional acceptance that never arrived. The exploitation of others was not evil in its origin. It was the only relational template the developing psyche had access to. Take what you need before it is taken from you. Now, hold all of that. Tinder what the super empath's no contact actually does to this structure. We have already established that the super empath was uniquely positioned, more than anyone else in the narcissist's life, to actually perceive that buried original self. Their depth of empathy allowed them to sense the wound beneath the behavior, the fear beneath the aggression, the longing beneath the contempt, and the narcissist, however unconsciously, felt that perception, perhaps for the first time since childhood, the dangerous and intoxicating possibility of being genuinely known. When the super empath leaves, completely, cleanly, without the ambiguity that allows hope to persist, they take that possibility with them. And what remains is not simply grief. What remains is the full, unmedicated weight of the original abandonment. The no contact does not create a new wound. It activates the oldest one. It lands on the nervous system not as a present-day rejection, but as a confirmation of the deepest fear the narcissists always carried, that if someone truly sees them, completely and without illusion, they will ultimately choose to leave. Gabor Mate reminds us that trauma is not what happens to us. It is what happens inside us as a result of what happens to us. And the super empath's departure happens inside the narcissist as a repetition of the original trauma, precise, devastating, and this time without the childhood mechanisms of dissociation and defense fully available to absorb the impact. Because those mechanisms were built for a child, and the wound they are now being asked to protect is being reopened by an adult who saw everything, stayed as long as they could, and then chose themselves anyway. And that choice, clear-eyed, compassionate, and absolute, does not just break the narcissist's heart. It breaks the story they told themselves about why the original wound was never their fault, and forces them, perhaps for the first time, to sit alone with the question they have spent an entire lifetime running from. There is something we have been, terminize at first in the next reckling, and I want to now address it directly. Because everything we have discussed, the supply drought, the shattered mirror, the collapsed control system, the reactivated wound, all of it has an additional dimension that operates at a level most people do not immediately recognize. And that dimension has to do not just with what the narcissist loses emotionally or structurally, but with what they lose narratively. Because the narcissist does not simply live a life. They construct a story about their life. And that distinction between living and narrating is one of the most psychologically significant features of the narcissistic personality. Just let me explain what I mean by that. All human beings engage in narrative self-construction to some degree. We are, as the philosopher Paul Ricoeur argued, fundamentally storytelling creatures. We make sense of our experience by organizing it into coherent sequences, beginnings, middles, meanings. Do we need our lives to tell a story that feels, at its core, intelligible? That feels like it is going somewhere. That positions us as agents rather than simply as things that things happen to. But for the narcissist, this narrative function is not merely a way of making meaning. It is a survival mechanism. The internal story they construct, in which they are exceptional, misunderstood, uniquely gifted, perpetually surrounded by P.O.P. who either worship them or fail to appreciate them adequately, is the scaffolding that holds the entire psychological structure upright. It is not incidental to who they are. It is, in the most functional sense, who they are. Remove the narrative, and you do not simply leave them confused. You leave them structurally unsupported. And the super empath was not a minor character in that narrative. They were, in almost every case, one of its central pillars. Think about what the super empath represented within the narcissist's internal story. They were the person whose extraordinary depth and sensitivity chose the narcissist, which confirmed the narcissist's belief in their own exceptional nature. They were the person who stayed through the worst behavior, which confirmed the narcissist's belief in their own indispensability. They were the person who tried repeatedly and at great personal cost to reach the buried humanity within, which the narcissist could privately interpret as evidence that even their darkest self was worth pursuing. Every dimension of the super empath's engagement fed a different chapter of the narcissist's self-authored story. No contact does not simply end the relationship. It retroactively dieted the entire narrative. Because when the super empath leaves completely, when there is no ambiguity, no ongoing negotiation, no door left even slightly to our sides, the story the narcissist was telling cannot hold its previous shape. The chapter that read, "They always come back because I am irreplaceable," now requires rewriting. Chapter that read, "My depth and complexity is what drew them to me," now sits next to a conclusion that contradicts everything that came before it. The narrative coherence, so painstakingly maintained, so central to psychological stability, begins to fracture. Erik Erikson, in his work on identity development, described the integrated self as one that maintains a sense of inner continuity, a felt experience of being the same person across time, across contexts, across relationships. For the narcissist, whose authentic self was never fully integrated, that sense of continuity depends almost entirely on narrative consistency, on the story remaining stable, on the characters in it behaving according to the roles assigned to them. When the super empath refuses their assigned role, when they step entirely outside the story and decline to return, the narcissist faces something that strikes far deeper than heartbreak. They face the collapse of the framework through which they understood not just the relationship, but themselves. The narrative that organized their identity loses its most important supporting character. And, without that character, the plot no longer makes the kind of sense it once did. Gab speaks about how so much of our suffering is generated not by circumstances themselves, but by the stories we attach to circumstances and the terror we experience when those stories are no longer sustainable. For the narcissist, the super empath's permanent absence creates precisely that terror. Not grief, exactly. Something more disorienting than grief, something closer to the vertigo of a person who has just discovered that the ground they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. Asterisk, because when the person who was the main character in your story about yourself walks away and writes you entirely out of theirs, you are not just left heartbroken. You are left without the plot. And a narcissist, without a coherent narrative, is not simply sad. They are structurally lost in a way that no new supply, no new relationship, no new performance can quickly or easily repair. We have arrived now at something that almost everyone who has ever gone no contact from a narcissist has experienced, and it tends to arrive at the most vulnerable moment, precisely when the empath has finally found their footing. Precisely when the silence has begun to feel less like loss and more like liberation, precisely when the nervous system has started, tentatively, to remember what peace feels like. The message arrives, or the phone call, or the unexpected appearance, or the carefully orchestrated encounter through a mutual connection. It comes wrapped in different packaging, depending on the narcissist. Sometimes as remorse, sometimes as rage, sometimes as a crisis requiring immediate attention, times as a tenderness so precisely calibrated to the empath's specific longing that it bypasses every rational defense that was so painstakingly constructed. This is the hoover, named, with uncomfortable accuracy, after the vacuum cleaner, because its entire purpose is to suck back in what was lost. And I want to be unambiguous about something here, because the cultural conversation around this phenomenon tends toward either demonization or romanticization, and neither serves the person trying to navigate it clearly. The hoover is not, at its root, simply a manipulative tactic deployed by a calculating predator. It is that in its effect, but in its origin, it is something more human and more desperate than that framing suggests. It is panic in action. It is the behavioral expression of everything we have been discussing: the supply drought, the shattered mirror, the collapsed control system, the reactivated wound, the fractured narrative, all of it converging into a single urgent, compulsive drive to restore what was lost. The narcissist who hoovers is not, in that moment, strategizing in the cool, detached way we might imagine. They are dysregulated. They are experiencing something that functions neurologically very similarly to what an addict experiences in acute withdrawal, a system overwhelmed by absence, driven by a compulsion that bypasses conscious reasoning entirely. The pursuit feels to them like necessity, like oxygen seeking. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult for the super empath to navigate, because the super empath, whose extraordinary perceptual depth allows them to sense the genuine desperation beneath the performance, can feel, with painful accuracy, that the distress is real. It is real. That must be acknowledged honestly. The narcissist's pain in this moment is not fabricated. The longing is genuine. The destabilization is authentic. What is not genuine is the implicit promise embedded in the hoover, the suggestion that this time will be different, that the recognition of loss has produced the kind of fundamental internal change that would make return anything other than a repetition of the same cycle. Because here's what the research and clinical experience consistently demonstrate. The hoover is not a transformation. It is a retrieval attempt. The narcissist is not returning to offer something different. They are returning to restore something familiar. And the distinction between those two things, between genuine change and the performance of change, is the exact distinction the Super Empath must hold with absolute clarity in that moment. Mario Jacobi, drawing on Jungian frameworks, wrote about how the longing for connection, however genuine, cannot substitute for the capacity for connection. Applying and capacity are not the same thing. Feeling the loss of someone is not the same as being equipped to love them without harm. Then the narcissist, in the grip of the hoover impulse, has the former in abundance and the latter not at all. Gabor reminds us that compassion without boundaries is not compassion. It is self-abandonment, dressed in the language of love. The super empath who understands the hoover, who can hold genuine compassion for the narcissist's authentic pain, while simultaneously refusing to re-enter a dynamic that required their own destruction to sustain. Asterisk that empath is not being cruel. They are being the clearest, most loving version of themselves, because they have finally learned that the most profound act of compassion they can offer is the one they first extend to themselves. There is a profound irony at the heart of everything we have been examining. And I want to sit with it for a moment, because it contains something important, something that speaks not just to the mechanics of these relationships, but to the deeper architecture of how exploitation actually functions and how it ultimately undoes itself. The very quality, why the narcissist spent years weaponizing against the super empath, the extraordinary depth of their empathy, the seemingly inexhaustible capacity for compassion, the instinct to see the humanity in even the most damaging behavior, that same quality, once turned inward, becomes the most impenetrable boundary the narcissist has ever encountered in their life. Let that sit for a moment, because this is not a small observation. This is the central reversal of the entire dynamic. The narcissist chose the super empath, at least in part, precisely because that empathy seemed like a permanent vulnerability, a perpetual entry point, a door that could always eventually be reopened. Timed for a time, often a significant, painful, costly amount of time, they were correct. The super empath's capacity to feel the narcissist's pain, to sense the wounded child beneath the destructive behavior, to believe in the possibility of genuine change, kept them returning, kept them forgiving, kept them trying to bridge a gap that the narcissist had no genuine intention, and perhaps no genuine capacity, to meet them across. But here is what the narcissist fundamentally misunderstood about the nature of deep empathy. They understood it as softness, as malleability, as a weakness dressed in the language of virtue. What they could not perceive, because their own emotional architecture made it invisible to them, is that genuine empathy, fully developed, is not simply the capacity to feel others. It is the capacity to feel truly, to perceive reality with a depth and accuracy that eventually becomes impossible to override with illusion. And the super empath, over the course of the relationship, was developing exactly that perception. Every cycle of idealization and devaluation added data, Every hoover followed by the same patterns, added clarity. Every moment of genuine self-betrayal, choosing the narcissist's comfort over their own truth, left a mark that the body and the psyche kept recording, faithfully, even when the conscious mind was still trying to reframe the narrative in more charitable terms. Bessel van der Kolk's work on somatic trauma teaches us that the body holds what the mind tries to release. The super empath's body, exhausted, hypervigilant, carrying the accumulated weight of years of emotional labor and self-abandonment, eventually reaches a threshold that no amount of compassion for the other can override. The empathy does not disappear. It redirects. It turns with the same depth and precision it always possessed toward the self that was neglected for so long. And when that happens, when the super empath begins to feel their own pain with the same generous attention they always extended to the narcissists, something fundamental shifts. Cause they cannot unsee what they now see. They cannot unfeel what their body has been recording. The empathy that once made them endlessly forgiving of the narcissist's behavior now makes them exquisitely attuned to the cost of returning to it. Every overture the narcissist makes is now felt, not just with the heart but with the accumulated somatic memory of every previous cycle. Every promise registers against the physical record of every previous broken one. The door that once seemed permanently available is not closed in anger. It is not slammed in resentment. It is quietly, firmly, and permanently sealed, not with hardness, but with the deepest possible form of self-knowledge. And that kind of closure, rooted not in bitterness but in truth, is something the narcissist's entire toolkit was never designed to overcome. Asterisk, because you cannot manipulate someone's compassion when that compassion has finally, fully come home to themselves. And the same depth of feeling that once kept them returning is now the very thing that makes return impossible. So we have traveled a significant distance together in this conversation. From the mechanics of supply, through the shattering of mirrors, the collapse of control, the reactivation of ancient wounds, the fracturing of narrative, the desperation of the hoover, and the ultimate redirection of empathy back toward the self. Each layer brought us closer to something that I want to name now with the full weight it deserves. Because this final point is not simply another mechanism, it is not another way of understanding what the narcissist loses or why they panic. It is something larger than that. It is the culmination of everything, the place where the personal becomes universal, where one relationship's ending points towards something profound about the nature of transformation itself. When a super empath goes no contact, truly, completely, without ambiguity or reservation, they are not simply leaving a relationship. They are completing a metamorphosis. They are completing a metamorphosis. And the narcissist, whatever else they are, whatever damage they have caused, whatever wounds they carry and distribute, is standing at the threshold of that transformation, watching something emerge that their entire psychological system was designed to prevent. Carl Jung spoke about the concept of the wounded healer, the idea that our deepest gifts often emerge directly from our deepest injuries. That the places where we were most broken, most tested, most pushed beyond what we believed we could endure, become, if we do the work, the precise source of our greatest wisdom and strength. This is not a comfortable idea. It asks us to hold two things simultaneously: the genuine wrongness of what was done to us, and the genuine possibility that surviving it, integrating it, refusing to be defined or destroyed by it, produces something in us that nothing easier ever could. The super empath who emerges from a narcissistic relationship having done that work is genuinely different from the person who entered it. Not harder, not colder, not closed. In many ways, paradoxically, more open, because they have discovered that they can survive the unsurvivable, that their sense of self can be attacked at its foundations and rebuilt stronger, that their empathy, tested against one of the most demanding relational experiences possible, did not break them. It educated them. It showed them exactly where their boundaries needed to be, exactly what self-abandonment costs, exactly what it feels like to choose another person's comfort over their own truth, and what it feels like to finally, irrevocably, stop doing that. This is what the narcissist sense when the super empath goes no contact and does not return. Not just the loss of supply, not just the loss of their mirror, not just the loss of control. They sense the presence of someone who has been, in the most genuine psychological sense, forged. Someone who entered the relationship as one thing and is leaving it as another. Someone who took the very worst that the dynamic had to offer and metabolized it into self-knowledge, into boundaries, into an authenticity so thoroughly tested that it cannot be easily destabilized. Again, and the narcissist's ego, which has always operated by finding and exploiting the gap between who people present themselves to be and who they actually are, has no purchase on this. There is no gap to exploit. The performed self and the authentic self have been brought into alignment through suffering and through choice. There is nothing to get underneath, nothing to lever open, nothing to manipulate. Gabor Mate speaks about how authenticity is not simply a personality trait. It is the result of a choice, made repeatedly, often at great cost, to honor the truth of one's own experience over the comfort of a familiar illusion. The super empath, in going no contact and remaining there, is making that choice in its most complete and irreversible form. They are choosing reality over comfort, truth over familiarity, self over approval. And in doing they become something the narcissist's greatest fear always pointed toward, a person so fully inhabiting their own life, so completely returned to themselves, that the narcissist's presence or absence no longer determines anything essential about who they are. Interesting, in that, not the leaving, not the silence, not the absence, but the becoming, is what the narcissist can never recover from. Because you cannot reclaim someone who has finally completely claimed themselves.